One of the biggest decisions voters will make this election season is about, well, voting. Question 3 on the ballot seeks to eliminate the current partisan primary election system, where Democrats and Republicans each have their own separate contests. In its place, the ballot question would create a single all-party primary featuring candidates from all stripes, and the top two would advance, even if they're both Democrats, both Republicans, both third party, whatever mix. It's a weighty choice that could fundamentally transform the way elections work and campaigns run. The good news for voters is that Massachusetts is not the petri dish for a never-before-tried experiment. A handful of other states, including California and Washington, already have these systems in place and have for years. I'm Chris Lisinski, and this week on the Codcast, we're diving deep on California's top two all-party primary system. My guest is Andrew Sinclair, a political scientist in California who studies American political reforms. California has used a top two all-party primary system for its elections since 2012. So what can Massachusetts learn? Let's find out. I'm here joined now by Andrew Sinclair, a professor of government at Claremont McKenna College out in Claremont, which is part of Los Angeles County in California. Professor Sinclair, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, we are so interested to learn more about our peers out there in the Golden State. Massachusetts voters this November will get a chance to decide if we should stick with our current primary election system where Republicans vote for Republicans, Democrats vote for Democrats, independents get to pick which one they vote in, but never shall the twain cross. The choice is whether to embrace something like California has, where all candidates appear on a single primary ballot and the top two advance to a general election. As I understand it, that decision in California was also made by voters years ago. Could you tell us a little bit about how California's system came to be?
Sure. Yeah, it was passed by voters in 2010, and so used for the first time in 2012, which happened to be when I was in graduate school, which is how I got turned on to studying this. And then we've used it ever since. However, it has a much longer history in California. There's been a considerable amount of experimentation with different types of election rules, and California was one of the leading states of the progressive era, experimenting with a whole different variety of ways of doing government. And so there's sort of an antecedent going back a long way.
Who were the big backers of the idea at the time that it went to the ballot and won voter support? Which voices, which organizations were responsible for building the most momentum?
Right. So the interesting thing in California is this came from a variety of people. Its highest profile backer was Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. However, the real source of this was just a deep frustration with how things were going in California at the time. So California had been experiencing a significant governance crisis, really centered around the yearly failure to pass a budget. And the basic problem in the legislature was you had a supermajority requirement at the time. You needed some Republicans to vote for a compromise or some Democrats to vote for a compromise, and it was really hard to get there. And so California passed a variety of reforms at the same time, trying to address various aspects of this governance crisis, including the nonpartisan redistricting commission, and ultimately eliminating the supermajority requirement to pass a budget as well.
That's so interesting. Our listeners will find that very familiar because Massachusetts has not passed an on-time budget in something like 16 or 17 years. It's an annual tradition up on Beacon Hill for us, for the Democratic supermajority to approve interim budgets and slowly meander their way to a final spending plan sometime in the new fiscal year, even if it's a few weeks late. How did political parties feel about the ballot question when it was first proposed? Did the California Democratic Party and the California Republican Party make a point of urging voters not to support the idea?
In general, this is the one thing that political parties can usually agree on, is that they don't like these rules. And that's been the case in California as well.
So one of the chief arguments as voters here in Massachusetts are thinking about this, one of the chief arguments they hear from proponents is that we have terrible competition. Our state legislative races are, not exaggerating, the least competitive in the country. This cycle, more than 3 in 5 state house and state senate districts will have just one single candidate on the ballot, almost always an incumbent. And supporters of an all-party top two primary system say that it's a way to boost competition, especially in a heavily blue blue state where many races are decided in the primary, they contend, why not ensure that if the race is going to come down to two Democrats, at least the general election voters get to make that decision instead of the primary? So in the 15 or so years since California has embraced this, what have you actually seen? Is there any evidence that California's embrace of a top two system has actually boosted competition?
There's really three things people spend a lot of time looking at, and they're all related with the top two in California. So competition is one, participation is the other, and moderation is the third one, right? So for competition, the prerequisite for that is you need people to run for office, right? So if only one person runs, there's not a lot going on there. But conditional on people running for office, the interesting thing about the top two is that sometimes you do get, particularly in heavily Democratic districts, these Democrat on Democrat general elections, right? And they occur the most frequently in the most extreme districts. So that is the main observable and pretty inarguable result of the top two. And then competition is related to participation, but also it's a distinct concept, right? So participation is more difficult because you have to ask relative to what. So with participation, what happens is that if you get one of these D on D general elections in a very democratic state assembly district or something, right? That moves to the general elections. So the people who are making the final choice, there's more of them because the participation in general elections is higher. Between primary types, right, the top two did not create this huge wave of primary participation, which some people had hoped for. It's not zero, right? But it's not like 80% of Californians turn out to vote all the time in the primaries now, and it's really high. I think in the most recent gubernatorial primary this spring, turnout was around 40-ish%. And in the last of the primary elections using the old party primary system in 2010, it was around 33% or so. But that's not the full story, because you have to ask participation in what by whom, right? So in the old system, if 33% of Californians, California registered voters participated in the primary, some of those were participating in a Republican primary, where in 2010, that was not a candidate that was going to win. It was a Republican year nationwide in 2010, but still California is a pretty safely Democratic state, and I don't think many people expected the Republicans to win that election. And then you had a bunch of independents where they nominally could have chosen to participate in the Democratic primary, and many just did not pull that ballot. They may not have known that they could. It may have been that they had registered to vote by mail and didn't request the ballot in this kind of thing, right? You can think about different ways that the election administration rules can interact with these types of primary rules. But a lot of people didn't actually participate. So when you look at how many people participated in the primary that actually selected the Democratic candidate in 2010 for governor, that turns out to be about 15% of the registered voters. Right. And so, many of the people who voted in the gubernatorial primary this year, they did vote for Republican candidates, but they were participating in an election. Their choice mattered. And whether they turned out to vote for Republicans, which Republican they were going to vote for, whether they could be persuaded to vote for Democrats, that actually mattered in the election. And so participation, you have to ask a little bit relative to whom. And then the moderation question is the one that's the most contested, right, with the most mixed findings in political science, and also very challenging because we don't always agree on what moderation means.
I'm curious, how this has affected partisan dynamics. Massachusetts is a state where Democrats hold every statewide office. They hold the entire congressional delegation and more than 80% of the state legislature. Would an all-party primary system play out differently in that kind of environment than in a state with a more even split between the two major parties, or at the very least, a more competitive minority party? Is there a way to know that?
It's not commonplace for people to describe California as a state with a competitive minority party. So I would say that these are fairly similar places in that regard, that there's, safely Democratic states. And you look at the legislature and you say, who's the swing vote in the legislature, right? And it's going to be a Democrat in both states. The interesting thing about what the top two does is it means that no matter how safe your district is, there is some chance that you are facing a general election against someone of your own party. So the party labels aren't going to be a cue to voters anymore. And that you're going to have to make your case to voters that you're the right person. And that's going to be to the larger general election pool. They'll have Republicans in it. Oftentimes it's the case that you get two Democrats, the Republicans say, I don't care, I'm not going to vote in this race. But some of them do. And none of them would vote in a Democratic primary. Right. And so you have to think about, how do I appeal to this broader group? And you don't know what your future election is going to look like. And so when you're thinking about, I got an email from a constituent, right? Do I respond to this email? Do I try and solve this person's problem? And in a state where, you just have to win a fairly low turnout Democratic primary, you may not worry about that as much. But if you're thinking, oh no, this person might actually be a voter that I want and I need in a larger turnout D-on-D race, maybe I'm going to actually try and help this person. Or maybe I'm going to try and craft policies that will make people happy and vote for me when I face an election for this or some other higher office. And so I think that's the impact of the top two, right? Is it makes it so there's no genuinely safe district, which is one of the reasons why sometimes politicians don't like it, I think.
So let's talk with a little bit more specificity. Ballpark's okay, but are there any figures, any data you could point to help Massachusetts voters understand just how common same-party general elections have been since California's embrace? Is it the kind of thing that happens every single cycle without fail? Is it once in a blue moon?
Yeah, you get some in every cycle, right? And it depends a little bit on how that particular election year is panning out. And the basic dynamics here are pretty straightforward, and it's just about how much elbow room there is on the ballot once you get people voting, right? So you tend to get Democrat on Republican races in places that are roughly competitive, and depending as you start to grow that electorate on either extreme, you get more space to get a second person from that party on the ballot, and then most of those are still going to end up being Democrat versus Republican races, right? But you're going to get some. And it's enough that the politicians will notice that this is a risk and think about it. And most of the time, that the person who would normally win under any other system is going to win here, right? I think this is the academic challenge around a lot of evaluating the impact of these reforms is, how big of an impact are we talking about here, right? Because most of the time, many good politicians are going to win no matter what the election rule is. But you're going to get some, and politicians seem to be fairly sensitive to small risks of losing. And so the idea is you generate the responsiveness out of that small risk that they lose, particularly if they do things that irritate their constituents.
How about the so-called spoiler effect? And also, please correct me if spoiler effect is not actually this phenomenon, if that's a different one. Just as a regular news consumer, all spring, I was bombarded with headlines about California's gubernatorial primary and fears among Democrats that the high number of Democrats running would split the vote and would let two Republicans sneak through to a general election. Is there any evidence that does happen, that that's a real risk, or is that more of a fear in theory that opponents tend to inflate?
Right. So the particular case that people worry about is if you have a very Democratic district, and California as a whole is roughly on the margins of that. You have a place that Democrats expect to win in a state like this. And if we were talking about Idaho, we'd be talking about Republicans in the same way, right? If it's a district that the majority party expects to win, that they will split their vote between too many candidates, and that two candidates from the minority party will advance, and that this is in some way a bad outcome for democracy. There's a couple of things to say about this. So the first is, this has happened in some of the legislative, like state legislature or congressional district elections, but it's a really, really rare outcome. We've had, over 1,000 of these types of elections so far. As far as I know, there's basically 3 cases that people usually talk about. And for each one, there's a yeah, but to it. Right. So the most famous example happened in Congressional District 31 in 2012. So this was the first use of the top two primary. So nobody really quite knew what to expect out of it in California. Now people are aware this is an issue, right? But the first time around, people really didn't know what to expect. it interacted with redistricting. So you got two strong Republican candidates, one who was a House incumbent, redistricted into the same district. Then you had, the Democrats split multi-way. But it was also the case that Democrats just didn't vote that year in the primary. So the two Republicans that advanced, had more than 50% of the vote, right? So if you don't vote, you won't win, right? And that's the big lesson from that election, is you actually have to turn your voters out. Another one happened in 2022 in a state Senate race. In that case, the Republican field split. Two Democrats advanced in a district that the Republicans had a good chance to win. But there's a big but about that as well, which is the winning candidate was a more conservative Democrat who then switched parties to become a Republican and just ran in this cycle as a Republican. So, there's some context there, I think, that really matters. And there's another district that was a state assembly district, where you had a same kind of setup where it's a multi-way split amongst the Democrats, and two Republicans advanced. But it was a district that had been fairly Republican. It had been represented in that redistricting cycle by Republicans earlier in the decade, and it was sort of going through a transition as places do over time. And so all three of those examples, right, there's something else there. And also, you should think about these in the context of other election systems, where parties that should win an election sometimes lose them, even with partisan primaries, right? That the comparison case is not a 0% loss rate for majority parties in districts that are like this. And the more you get towards the safer the district gets, the harder it is for these sorts of splits to occur, right? Because you're basically taking the presidential vote share for a district and splitting it between that party's candidates in some way. As the Republican vote share shrinks in some of these districts, if you've got a 20% Republican presidential vote share in some districts in California, like you do, right? The worst case scenario for Democrats is that two Republicans split that with 10% of the vote each. And so then you need your best Democrat to fail to beat the second best Republican in a district where, the threshold there is really low. Right? You've only got to get somebody to, 10, 11%. And if you can't do that, you've probably messed up somewhere in the politics of this. Right. And I think that was my impression of the California gubernatorial primary this year. Right. It was the bad setup for Democrats. Right. You had two Republican candidates. They both polled relatively evenly earlier in the race. A bunch of Democrats. This is what set off the panic. Right. And then the Democrats did a whole bunch of things that are like, here's a train wreck coming, right? So the leading Democrat had to drop out of the race because of sexual misconduct allegations. Then you had the state party failed to endorse anyone before the election. And then all the top tier Democrats more or less sat on the sidelines and didn't endorse candidates, right? And that's the fire alarm that's going off, right? And in the end, a Democrat came in first place, and with 28% of the vote or so, and the person that person had to beat, right, the second best Republican, had 10% of the vote. So it wasn't even close to actually the thing people were worried about wasn't even close, right? And it is true that the Democratic Party in California, the people running for office, right, lots of other people had to work hard to make that outcome happen. Right. So there was a lot of messaging around, don't let the Republicans split the vote. Everybody heard about this, right? Don't let the Republicans split the vote. But we're going to run a bunch of polls and see which Democrats are the most viable and try and encourage you to vote for the Democrats that are the most viable, right? A whole bunch of these things happened. They did these things. But when you do those things, even if you mess up kind of everything else, right, you still win. And it wasn't close. And when you look at for these statewide offices, what that threshold second Republican has been, it's a really low bar. Now, there's a trade-off here, right? Like it could happen. There is a risk that it could happen. But going back to your point about competition, it can't be the case that people both want competitive elections and to be guaranteed to win all the time. Like that's just an inescapable trade-off. You have to, if you're going to have real competition in some way, you're going to try and encourage people to have to work hard to get your vote, then there has to be a risk that they might actually lose.
You said earlier that California's Democratic Party and Republican Party both didn't like the idea. That's also the case here in Massachusetts. anyone who's interested, I just published a story last week about this. Go to commonwealthbeacon.org to read. And that makes sense logically. It would change their roles. It would change the influence they have over primaries. Is there any evidence that suggests one party has benefited more than the other? Is there a clear winner and a clear loser in California's all-party primary system, or is it just not break down along that kind of an even split?
I don't think it's really had an effect on the parties overall in terms of which party controls the state legislature, how many congressional seats you're going to win. These are not big effects, right? With any type of primary system in California over this period of time, you would expect Democrats to be winning statewide because most Californians really don't like Donald Trump. And we're living through a period of time in which that's the Republican brand, and it is in California as well. And so, that hasn't really panned out as a party difference, right? But the argument often is within parties, between different factions, between different interest groups about who thinks they're going to be better off or worse off with these different kinds of rules. And then there's another sort of argument that goes on in the background of all this, which is the sort of counter argument amongst political scientists is that it would be better if you had stronger parties. So there's a set of people who just think that this is a better way to do politics, right? Is to have stronger parties where they can really internalize the trade-offs over nominating offices and things like that. And then another argument beside that, where there's a concern that you're spending a lot of effort on this reform and that maybe some other reform might be better, right? And so sometimes you get opposition to these kinds of rules from people who would prefer different kinds of elections, right? And so there's a lot of back and forth between, do you want top 2 or do you want top 4 with ranked choice voting like Alaska, right? And that's a dispute about what type of reform is optimal, less than necessarily even a party faction debate.
We're going to take a very quick break here and hear from some of my colleagues at Commonwealth Beacon. We'll be back in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Laura Colarusso, editor of Commonwealth Beacon. As you may know, Massachusetts voters will face 9 ballot questions this November. That's 9 decisions with major policy implications that Commonwealth residents get a chance to weigh in on. So this September, we're launching a ballot question guide to help get voters to the polls feeling confident and informed. We're hard at work, creating printed guides, multimedia explainers, and pop-up newsletters that dive into the context you need to know. Our goal is to demystify the issues at play and help you understand the consequences of each individual ballot measure. All of this, just like our usual reporting, will be free. That's only possible through member support. As you turn to the guide to learn about each question and the issues driving them, we hope you'll consider supporting this work, whether by sharing with a fellow voter or becoming a member. You can find more information on how to support this work in the show notes or visit commonwealthbeacon.org.
We are back. I am still here with Professor Andrew Sinclair from Claremont McKenna College talking about California's top 2 all-party primary system and what Massachusetts voters weighing a similar system should know about it. So, Andrew, in the, again, 15 years or so since California has embraced this system, what has it done to the role that money plays in politics? A very common argument that we are hearing every day here in Massachusetts is if you embrace an all-party primary system, wealthy donors will have even more influence and well-funded candidates will have even better prospects than they do under the current traditional split partisan primary system. Is there any truth to that?
I don't really think that's likely to be the case. Because if you look across American politics, with no matter what type of system that you're using, it matters that you have resources of some kind, right? Not always a person who has the most money is going to win in any of these systems, but all candidates running for office need resources of some kind. And money plays a big role in American politics and always has. An interesting backstory here in California, so you go all the way back to the debate about adopting direct primaries in California. The thing that had happened directly before that was in the 1906 California Republican Convention, the Southern Pacific Railroad basically bought the San Francisco delegation, literally bribed the boss of San Francisco to get their delegation in the convention to depose the sitting Republican governor and replace him on the ballot with a Republican that the Southern Pacific Railroad liked better. Right. And so this problem is really old. It works in lots of different kinds of systems. And so I wouldn't focus on that as the bigger issue, right? I think the bigger debate amongst political scientists is whether the direction is to go towards having stronger parties for all the benefits that stronger parties could provide of internalizing these kinds of debates and building strong tickets and vetting candidates and things like that, versus a more populist approach to politics where you throw it to the public and let the public sort it out.
In some states, an all-party primary reform is either contrasted with or combined with ranked choice voting, where voters are able to pick more than one candidate in order of how much they like them, and a first-place selection has more weight than a fourth-place selection. Some math goes on to figure out who comes out on top. Here in Massachusetts, voters rejected a ranked choice voting system 6 years ago in a 2020 ballot question. I don't think that's the case in California, but the reason I bring that up is voter behaviors would be fundamentally different under ranked choice voting. Voters would have a lot more calculus to do rather than just say, this one person is my person, I'm going with it. In a no ranked choice, yes, all-party primary system, do voter behaviors change substantially? Are there new incentives, new calculations that California voters have had to make since 2012? Or does your work and research show us that, for the most part, they're still just picking whichever candidate they like the most?
This is the fun one about primary elections, right? So here we go. The main thing about these ranked choice voting systems is to separate them into the kinds of ranked choice voting systems that are paired with partisan primaries, like in Maine, and the type of ranked choice voting systems that you have in Alaska that are paired with nonpartisan systems, right? So in Alaska, everybody votes. They just had the primary. Everybody votes for whoever they want. In the primary, you get one vote. The four candidates advance that have the most votes advance to the general election, and then you do ranked choice voting in the general election. Could be, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, and an independent or something like that, right? There are advantages and disadvantages of that versus a top two system. The nice thing about the ranked choice voting, like they have in Alaska, is this fear about, the primary split, right? You can address that with the top 4 ranked choice voting system. It does still matter, though. Ranked choice voting does not obviate the need to think about strategic voting in some way, right? It actually does matter who you rank first. And you can, depending on how you line those candidates up, you can switch the outcomes. What I like about the top 2 is it brings that tension to the surface. So in the primary, I have to think about whether the candidate I'm voting for, I'm going to cast my ballot for this person, is an electable person. And you see this happen, like in this year in the governor's race, right? Where people who've been polling a little bit at the bottom, their vote fell out at the end, right? Because some people thought, you know what? This guy's not going to win. Not going to win the primary, and I don't want the Republicans to win, so I'm going to vote for one of the 2 most viable Democrats, right? And people did that kind of calculation, and it was surfaced, and it was talked about, and it became the explicit thing that we were talking about. And with the ranked choice voting systems, that's a little bit hidden, right? On the other hand, there are nice advantages of the ranked choice voting, and so I think that it really doesn't matter. There pluses and minuses to either one, but overall, the biggest difference is you have these systems that have some nonpartisan component to them, either in the Alaska system or in the California one, where all the voters can participate on an equal basis in the election in all phases. And then you may get a situation where voters are choosing where party labels don't matter, right? Because you've got 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats that are the really ultimate choice. So, if you're ranking your choices on a ballot, you might still have to say, okay, there's 2 Republicans here. I'm a Democrat. Which one am I going to rank higher than the other? And so you get that same kind of sense out of both systems. And they I think, should have fairly similar effects in the long run. There's not a huge amount of data on either of these in a sense. So, I think the comparison between them is something that political scientists are still sorting out. But I tend to view them as fairly similar.
I just want to note and issue a challenge to all future guests that this is the fun one in response to a very wonky question is exactly the energy we strive for here on the Codcast. So if everyone else could please match that, thank you very much in advance. At least 4 other states, by my count, Colorado, Arizona, Montana, and South Dakota, rejected roughly similar ballot measures in 2024. Some of those were top 2 systems, some were top 4, some had ranked choice voting, but they all had a central theme of putting candidates from multiple parties onto a single ballot. 4 states just 2 years ago. Now it's on the ballot here in Massachusetts. Is there any reason to believe that there's a national movement underway, that there's any kind of centralized organization or overlap between these campaigns, or is it just a coincidence and we're at a national moment of states rethinking how they run their elections?
I mean, there certainly are advocacy groups that work across states, right? There's a group called Open Primaries that advocates for open primaries, and they do it across the United States, right? And I think when you go back and you look at the 2024 election results, the challenge for many of those states is that these type of election reforms became really associated with anti-Trump activism, right? The idea was you were going to change the problem was the Republicans in Congress, and you were going to switch to these types of systems to beat the Republicans in Congress, right? And particularly after the sort of recent set of elections in Alaska, right? That sort of got this dynamic going about ranked choice voting as well. And so there's a challenge for advocates of these types of systems, and that's you have to address the concerns of Democrats, either about their party, right? So they want the Democratic Party to advance to. There's a lot of energy. It's like from Democrats versus Trump, right? And so you have to convince Democrats that this is going to help them fight Donald Trump. But on the other hand, in many places, you want Republicans to vote for it. And I think that this is the regrettable thing in some way about the way that some of this has been pitched to people for advocates who like these things is it became very partisan. We see those splits in support for the top two in California. If you look at polling over time, that it has polarized a little bit. Like Democrats like it more than Republicans do. And that's ironic because its origin in California in some ways is really connected with moderate Republicans. But also it makes it a political challenge, especially if you want to pass this in a state that's actually not Massachusetts or not California, right? But I think there's a populist argument to be made in favor of these types of reforms, and I don't think that populist argument was made very effectively to Republican voters in 2024 to encourage them to think about these.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that polling shows Californians today that Democrats tend to like the top two system they have more than Republicans do. I'm guessing that there's majority support since a majority of Californians lean to the left. Is there any sense of buyer's remorse among voters? And I suppose we should probably use this to get at the more pressing issue. How much longer will this be in place in California? Because hopefully you can tell us more. I believe that there's an effort to repeal this through the ballot as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it will likely, face a significant challenge because the Democratic Party doesn't like it. The Republican Party doesn't like it. There's a lot of people who don't like it, right? There are people who have a variety of different preferences that would be satisfied by repealing it, either because they think some other reform is better or they, think that it hurts their particular faction, right? And there's always a possibility that the thing gets repealed. It is really hard to go to voters, not necessarily to elite voters. Like if you made this argument at the American Political Science Association conference, it'd be a lot easier to convince people to repeal it than if you go to voters of California and say, "Hey, I've got an idea. Let's put more power in the hands of people you really like, political parties." Like that's a compelling argument to many political scientists, but it's going to be a tough sell to California voters, but it may that may happen, right? And certainly for people who are very engaged with this space, there are real opponents who have very good ideas about how you could possibly reform politics in different ways. I think the challenge always is that you have to get these things through some political process where the voters really don't like parties. And that's always been the dynamic is like, do you go more towards these types of populist reforms or away from them? It's a lot easier to go towards them than away from them.
And very quickly, could you just refresh us on where that repeal effort stands today in late August 2026? Is that still in the process of winding its way to a future ballot, or does it already have a spot before voters locked in?
I believe we're going to vote for it, vote on it in the next cycle. But I'm not sure how well it will do.
Andrew Sinclair from Claremont McKenna College out in California. Thank you so much for joining us on the Codcast and diving very deep down this rabbit hole of all-party primaries. We hope that our listeners are a little bit more informed, or at least know what they might be getting themselves into if they're inclined to vote yes on question 3.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again to Andrew for joining me, and thanks to you for listening. I'm Chris Lisinski. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Our videos are edited by Charlie Cazella and Camilla Julian. Subscribe to the Codcast wherever you get your podcasts to stay informed about Massachusetts policy and state government. You can email us, codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org, if you ever want to get in touch. We'll be back next week.